All right. So I recognize a lot of faces. So I know that you guys know that we've already been through a number of areas in human resources. So yeah, you are on the downhill side, not of life, but of learning on this particular topic, Denise, just to underline that. We want to clarify. So we've covered a lot, and I'm happy today if we do have time. You guys feel free to use the Q&A time. I know Christine has to be out of here on time. I have a tendency to linger, but any questions that you guys have about any of these areas or what we cover today, fair game. You've got my email address. If you want to contact me directly, that's totally fine. What we're going to be focusing on today is, I know a lot of you are doing performance evaluations. I saw that based on the survey results, or you're somehow actually involved in that. If you're not doing the formal evaluations, you're kind of doing that development portion. So I want to cover that. We're also going to spend a little bit of time on unions. And of course, what HR training would be complete without progressive discipline, and learning how to legally fire people, which is one of our favorite things to do, right? So in HR, obviously, employee relations, it covers a lot more than terminations. I never enjoyed firing people. I've got to say that I have a lot of notches in my belt, but it was never pleasurable, I don't think, for me. And I know that there are individuals in the field that are kind of known as hatchet people, and they may thrive on pink slipping people, but that's like never been my thing. I've always considered when an employment relationship ends kind of on that basis, I feel a failure, a personal failure on my part or on behalf of the organization, that we didn't find a way to make that relationship more successful. So I would encourage you guys to kind of look at that employee-employer relationship in that fashion if you can. So as far as HR is concerned and employee relations, right, a lot of listening, okay? I had an open door policy. I know a lot of HR departments actually don't. Sometimes I would have 12 to 15 people in the queue down the hallway. In fact, they moved my office to the front of the administration building so we wouldn't have such a line in front of everybody else's offices. That way people could actually sit in the waiting area as a staging area. So spend a lot of time listening, being a sounding board for folks, and obviously being able to understand what it is that's going on out there, so that then we can kind of problem solve if it indeed is an issue that constitutes problem solving, right? We conduct activities to improve employee engagement. Hopefully you guys, especially since a lot of you are kind of satellite centers and HR isn't necessarily on site, you're probably having to tackle a lot of these sorts of activities yourself to try to increase employee engagement. So we can talk a little more about activities that you might want to partake in to do that if that's a challenge for you guys. We're not going to be covering it today. Addresses employee relations issues, conducts investigations. I did a lot of this sort of stuff, right, with employee investigations, Skelly hearings. We'll talk about that as a part of progressive discipline. A lot of stuff related to obviously disciplinary action up into and including termination, which may be, accepting resignation letters, filing terminations, sitting in on arbitration hearings, appeals meetings, et cetera, right? So HR does all of those things, but my guess is a lot of you are involved in this process long before HR actually sticks a foot in the door or shows up on site at your library location. So one of the things that we want to kind of make sure that we distinguish, right, is that we're all operating, I'm not so much anymore, but in California, right, we are an at-will employer. So you see this obviously in private sector. At-will employment means that employment relationship, whether you're the employee or the employer, right, you can part ways without notice at any point. Okay, when we were working at Montgomery Wards, right, when we were working at Kohl's, those were probably at-will employers, right? I mean, you could come in on one day and they'd hand you a check and tell you to clean out your locker if you were fortunate enough to have one, and you would go your own way, right? A lot of us now are actually working in agencies that, whether they're private or they're public, may have instituted a progressive disciplinary kind of process, which means that there are multiple stages, right? We typically, what we do is, and we'll go over the pyramid of the actual actions, but if something happens, whether it's related to performance or it's related to conduct, we typically have meetings, we kind of look into this, we may try to modify the behavior, right? There's an interaction that happens between you and the employee. before an actual separation of employment happens. All right. So important to understand the difference between conduct and performance. Okay. Important to understand the difference, right? Conduct issues, we could say, was, coming to work under the influence. I had physical altercations between employees. That would be conduct. Altercations between employees and patrons. That kind of crosses over a little bit into poor customer service. But when you have an employee that's, screaming at a patron across the service desk, telling them to go F themselves, that kind of crosses over more so into conduct than performance related to their actual scope of duties. Okay. When we talk about performance issues, we're looking more at tardiness is probably one that's common for you guys, that you see that a lot and have to deal with it. People not being able to show up to work on time. Productivity may be an issue, right? Where we may quantify work, like if individuals are doing shelving or they're working the book drop or something, and you come in and you're like, wow, you've been in here an hour. Normally we clear this in the mornings and say they've checked in 5 items, right? Performance issues. Librarians not doing their collection development activities, performance issues, right? So important to distinguish the difference, and I'll tell you the reason. The reason is when we look at progressive discipline, and I'm moving through this pyramid, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about each stage of the pyramid. Trying to figure out how to word this in a way that makes sense. If I have a performance issue, I get on this path, right? And say I'm dealing with this same kind of these recurring performance issues with an employee, and it's escalating up to the point that maybe I'm considering a suspension. Then all of a sudden I have a conduct issue, right? This particular employee pins another, I've had this happen in my library, pins another employee, it's provoked, but pins another employee against the stacks and literally threatens his life. And then as he's walking away, he manages to roll the book truck over his foot and breaks one of his toes, right? So now I've got a conduct issue in addition to my performance issue. I start on a whole new path or new track with that conduct issue. So I have these two different things going simultaneously. Okay. So when you go with progressive discipline, I wouldn't necessarily all of a sudden, because I know I have a conduct issue, jump to termination or jump to the next stage in the pyramid. These two things are on two separate tracks. Okay. So when we look at progressive discipline, and many of you, I'm assuming, probably have this in your libraries, whether you're a specialized library, museum, academic, law library. Some of you may be in at-will situations, but many of you probably have organizations that are abiding by progressive discipline. So you're going to have these stages. You may have one less, you may have one more. It's going to vary depending on your organization, but this is kind of the general model, right? We move from a very informal, casual kind of problem-solving dialogue that typically we refer to as a counseling session, then ultimately, obviously, to termination. Okay. And when we look at discharge, those of you who actually have been involved in terminations, you know that it may not end at this point, right? Depending on what's in your memorandum of understanding, there likely is going to be an appeal to your action, right? So that employee then is represented sometimes in front of arbitration. They make a case for why there might have been wrongful, termination. They may even be reinstated. Haven't had this happen on my watch, but I know it's happened on colleagues of mine. You may also be taken to court for wrongful termination, where someone might actually be reinstated via that path, depending on what your contract with your union states in terms of how you handle discharges. Okay. So I want to look at kind of each one of these stages just to give you a general idea. Counseling, and there should be a lot of counseling happening, right? Counseling is not a bad thing. Counseling is kind of an early intervention, right? Before we get to the point where we're talking about formal disciplinary action and putting, notes in employees' files, okay? Counseling is that opportunity for us to intervene early. So whether you're a supervisor, whether you're a manager, you're probably not going to be doing this, obviously, just with a coworker. It would mean that you would be more than likely in a position of power or authority and have people working underneath you, but you would counsel them, right? So you're clarifying what the situation is. When we are counseling, you want to try to right? Y'all know this about, we haven't talked about feedback here, but most of you have done these sorts of trainings in terms of communication. Feedback needs to be prompt, right? We don't want to talk to somebody about an issue that we've witnessed 4 or 5 days after the fact. Better that we can do it almost immediately. We want to provide this kind of feedback and counseling, obviously in a confidential setting, right? We're not out there humiliating people, embarrassing people, criticizing people in public. That's not a good situation for us, for them, or for their coworkers, okay? It's awkward for the patrons that are present, in fact. So you want it to be prompt, you want it to be private. You also want to be as specific as you can. Okay, so when you're giving people feedback in terms of counseling sessions and we're clarifying, what the issue was, we want to be able to give them a specific example, right? Be able to actually recreate that incident at the service desk that you witnessed that was potentially problematic, right? And then talk to them about how we can do that differently and what your expectations are of that interaction, right? At that point, hopefully, you're not seeing that particular behavior anymore. You may see other behaviors that require you to again counsel, right? But we wouldn't escalate, right? So the other thing that I want to mention to you at this point, if you guys are supervisors, if you're managers, I always told folks, make sure that you're keeping a supervisor's file, okay? Every employee that you have should have a file with their name on it that you keep in a locked file cabinet, right? Completely separate from their personnel file, completely separate. And it doesn't just include this kind of stuff, it includes the good stuff, right? If you get stuff in the suggestion box, where often, you'll have patrons leave really cool comment cards, complimentary things. Somebody leaves a note at a desk, somebody calls about great service that they got. Somebody completes a training program and wants to provide you with a copy of a certification that they got. All of that kind of stuff can go into this informal supervisor's file that you have on your employee, okay? You want to make sure if this employee that you've been coaching and working with for 3 or 4 years transfers to a branch, that should follow them, right? Because how many times have you been in a situation where you've been in a meeting or something and all of a sudden this person is talking about this employee being problematic? They're starting over in terms of progressive discipline, right? They're starting over and you're like, wow, we had actually escalated on that particular performance issue to the point of written reprimand. You shouldn't need to start over, right? Make sure that that historical record follows the employee, okay? Verbal or oral warning. This is typically the next level. And it is exactly what we say it is, right? Now we kind of ratchet it up a little bit, right? You did that counseling on the interaction at the service desk. 3 weeks later, you see them doing the same damn thing. And it's like, okay, time to have another conversation about this. What I would also do to make sure that they're really clear that we are indeed escalating, right? We're moving forward in this process, as I always like to, even though it seems kind of like an oxymoron, to document my verbal or oral warnings in writing, okay? That way you have a record. So whether that means you actually putting it out on letterhead or you sending that information in an email, creating some kind of written record that it's occurred is important. That way, you're starting to actually build this path, and you can show if for whatever reason your disciplinary action is contested at a later date, that you have indeed followed the stages of progressive discipline, okay? At this point, you're also starting to use that language of, if this employee, if the behavior continues, we are looking at having to escalate up into, termination. So that way they kind of know that this could result in further disciplinary action. They're on this track, okay? At this point, when I refer to this as disciplinary action, at this point, these things, according to your MOU too, shouldn't be going in to the employee's formal personnel file. This is another thing that goes into your supervisor's file. If we escalate further, we will attach this, right? We will attach this to a written reprimand that'll go into the formal file later. But right now, these are just supporting documents. They don't have any negative marks, right? As far as their personnel file goes, all right? Verbal or oral warning. Now we escalate to a written reprimand, okay? So again, 3 or 4 weeks pass or whatever, we're seeing the same stuff happen, right? They're clearly just for whatever reason not getting it or not turning it around. We're going to have another meeting, obviously, with the individual. And at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to issue this written reprimand. Okay. What I would recommend at this point, obviously, in addition to your letter referencing the past action that you've taken, both the counseling and the verbal warning, the issues that you discussed during that particular meeting, the expectations that you've listed, and obviously the fact that the employee hasn't been able to remedy those particular behaviors. In addition to that, what we probably want to do at that point, if we do indeed have a performance issue, is talk about a PIP, right? Performance improvement plan. All right. Because clearly at this point, it's like, okay, the conversations are not working. We need to come up with something that's a little formal, more formal even. And we need to make sure that we're, for me, exhausting every option, right? Every resource that we have to try to kind of turn this thing around. Because you've also got to understand, right? I mean, everybody knows that when you talk about employee retention, there's a huge cost to employee loss, right? Having to fill that, the disruption that happens. A lot of you know that your organizations may hold it open. They may hold it open for salary savings. They may hold it open because they're just kind of thinking about what they're going to do. They may hold it open because they want to see if they can put enough on your backs that they can save a little money here while still getting the same amount of work done, right? We've all seen that. In some cases, it may be intentional. In some cases, it may be inadvertent. If you don't have HR on site and they're like, man, you've got an expired eligible list, and I can tell you, we've got a lot of stuff in front of you. You're going to have to wait 3 or 4 months before we even start that particular library specialist recruitment, right? It may mean that you just have that huge hole for that extended period. So really important to kind of exhaust every option. When we look, I'm going to move to PIT, but because I want to talk about the performance improvement program in detail. We're going to talk about unions a little later, but I move this slide up because I know one of the things that happens for supervisors is, especially if you've got a really strong and active union in your library, there is this fear of like, when can I talk to folks? What can I say? Are they allowed to have representation? What role does that representation take during this particular meeting? The NLRA, which is the National Labor Rights Association, we'll talk about them more later. There was a case back in, I think it was like 1975 or something. Weingarten rights basically say that an employee has the right to union. I'm going to shrink sorry guys, I realized is that better? You can see the slides now without the shadow. The employee has the right to union representation during an investigatory interview. An investigatory interview occurs when, and this is important, this is not an or, folks, this is an and, okay? So management questions an employee to obtain information, right? That happens all the time, right? That happens all the time. This is where the and is crucial, it's essential, okay? So we're not only questioning the employee to get information, but the employee has a reasonable belief, reasonable, right? Not in their mind, but in everybody else's mind, reasonable belief that discipline or adverse consequences may be resulting. Okay. So if they feel that what they are going to disclose to you as a result of that meeting may end up in disciplinary action. And when we talk about disciplinary action, again, what we're looking at there is something that would actually be a part of their permanent employment record. Okay. So in most cases, and your agency may differ, I would encourage you to have this conversation, but in most cases, a counseling, a verbal warning don't constitute disciplinary action, right? Because we're not actually putting that in their formal record. It's not part of their personnel file at that point, not at that level, okay? So important to understand, disciplinary action, we're looking at written reprimands, we are looking at suspensions, we're looking at terminations, right? So an employee has a reasonable belief that discipline or other adverse consequences may result from whatever they disclose to you during that investigatory meeting, okay? At that point, they're entitled to representation, okay? And many of them, you guys can see up here, we actually have what they call it's basically your Weingarten rights. And most unions, at the point that somebody actually enrolls in membership, will hand out these cards so that they have a steward's name, they have a steward's contact info, they know what their rights are. So I always found it was good to actually let an employee know that they had right to representation in certain situations. I didn't feel that they needed to figure that out on their own. I would volunteer that information. Okay. At that point, they can decide if they want the meeting to continue. Okay. If they request a delay or a postponement because they want to have a representative with them, that's fine. We can do that. The other thing that we can do is we can just decide that we're not going to pursue this at all and we're going to end the meeting immediately, right? But if you are engaging in a meeting that meets this criteria 1 and 2 at the top of the screen, you want to make sure that that individual is aware of their rights. They are entitled to representation. Now, in some cases, right, you may start out having a meeting that you never intended to kind of what I would say is go south, right? But suddenly stuff starts to get revealed and you're like, whoa, you know, I had one once and it was like, that was a really cool t-shirt that you had, man. Where did you get that Berkeley Public Library tie-dye t-shirt? And then all of a sudden the guy says to me, he's like, oh, you know, so-and-so makes them and sells them online. And I was like, okay, well, is it part of like the Friends? Is the money being donated back to the library? And it's like, no, it's for personal profit. I was like, okay, we're in an area now where obviously we haven't authorized an employee to be using our formal copyrighted logo to sell and market apparel, right? So I had no idea we were going to go that way. I was just complimenting somebody on a freaking shirt. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh no, here we go, right? I need to adjourn this particular meeting. And, you know, we're going to go a different route, a more formal route. So you may find yourself in this position, not intending to be there. And at that point, once you realize that you're meeting this criteria, you need to either end the meeting immediately, give the employee an option as to whether or not they want to continue without a representative, or delay the meeting until they're able to get a rep. Okay. Important to understand, they may want a specific person and that specific person may have decided to go on a Hawaiian cruise for 3 weeks. They're not entitled to a specific person. They're just entitled to representation. Okay. Suspensions. I've been suspended without pay for 3 days. This is the idea, obviously, of temporary removal of an employee. Okay. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll actually put somebody on a suspension. I'm not going to say that. Most of you in your union contracts will have something that probably refers to administrative leave. You can't put an employee on suspension pending an investigation, right? Because that means that they're not being paid. If you have something happen, I had an issue happen, obviously, where it was really clear that we thought an employee had hacked and crashed the public computers. Somebody that has that kind of access and can potentially create that kind of havoc and do that kind of damage, we didn't want on site during an investigation, right? If you have some sort of physical confrontation, if you have that's violent, if you have something that verges on sexual harassment, what you may decide is to put an employee on administrative leave, which means they're not at work, but you're still paying them, while you can conduct an adequate investigation. Okay, so where the employee seems to present some kind of threat to either other employees' well-being or the functioning of your library, something like that, you would consider paid leave during the period that you conducted the investigation. Then you conduct the investigation, you have a hearing, which we'll talk about. The outcome may very well be you putting them on leave without pay, which would be the suspension as punishment or punitive action. Okay. Your Skelly meetings. This was one of the first questions I got asked when I moved into public sector as part of my interview panel. They said, what's a Skelly? And I was like, I had absolutely no clue what a Skelly was. I didn't even make an attempt to guess, which was really sad because I think that I probably in my gut knew that it had something to do with some crazy convoluted bureaucratic process, but I didn't even feign an attempt. So your Skelling, essentially, what your Skelly meeting is it indeed is a meeting. There's typically a note taker. There is the Skelly officer who is obviously present. Basically what you're doing at that point is you've put the employee on notice and said, we're proposing a suspension of 3 days based on this particular action. At that point, the employee has an opportunity to attend the Skelly meeting. They can choose not to. They don't have to contest it. They don't have to say their side, but they have an opportunity to respond. and attend that Skelly meeting, obviously, usually with representation. They'll usually select to have a steward or maybe somebody even at a higher level in the union attend that particular meeting. Basically what we're doing at that point is our Skelly officer, in most cases for you guys, it's probably going to be at a deputy or a director level. This usually won't be a manager at this point. We're kind of at the top tier of the organization when we conduct Skelly meetings. And we basically just let them know what their rights are. Their right is to respond to what our proposed disciplinary action is. At that point, the employee or the union representative will state their case, explain that maybe there were adverse actions, maybe the employee was provoked, maybe there were extenuating circumstances that we weren't aware of. Maybe they bring to our attention that another employee last year committed a similar offense, but only received 1 day suspension. This one's being proposed to 3. They may propose a reduction in whatever the discipline is that you propose. They may propose that you take it off the table entirely and they're reinstated as whole. So basically they kind of come back with what they want, and then your Skelly officer has an opportunity at that point to say, okay, I may meet you in the middle. I may accommodate your particular request, or no, I'm absolutely upholding what I had originally proposed. You're out on suspension for 3 days, whatever it happens to be. Usually at this point, remember we talked, when we talk about kind of beyond the discharge, beyond the suspension, there is still a process. Beyond the Skelly, there is still a process. After we've had this hearing, most of your memorandums of understanding, if you do indeed have an MOU, will dictate that there's an appeal, right? So you have a Skelly officer, and then you have someone in addition to that that will hear the appeals. Okay. Performance improvement plans. We had talked a little bit about PIPs. And shortly after this, I think we'll have Q&A, so you guys can kind of start pulling your questions together. But I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about specifics for performance improvement programs, right? Because I mean, this really is, for me, this is not about, it's not about ticking a box, you know, so that we can ultimately fire this person. This is about trying to essentially rehabilitate an employee that has ended up on the wrong path, or for whatever reason, maybe hasn't developed the skill set. For me, man, it's like leave no stone unturned. Okay. I'm going to try everything to see if I can turn the situation around and make this relationship successful. If not, at least I know I've done everything that I can, and it just didn't work out here in this particular situation. So we have to part ways. So tips for PIPs, all right? I think it's always good anytime you're doing these to talk about the things that they are doing well, right? Just like we would look at in a performance evaluation, and we'll talk more about performance appraisals a little later, but you know, make sure that it's not all focused on the negative. That can be so deflating for an individual. You're never going to be able to get them on board and energized to turn things around. Okay, so really important to highlight what they are doing well, in addition to obviously highlighting specifics about those different areas where we're seeing issues, right? And it's not necessarily everything, right? There are some specific things, whether they're related to customer service, whether they're related to, you know, some of the more physically demanding things, you know, like shelving and organizing or responding to their emails, whatever it happens to be, right? Be really specific about where those deficiencies are occurring, provide the dates that you've actually witnessed these sorts of things, give them details about the circumstances again, right? Using specific examples, not being vague, not being general. Then make sure to attach a job spec, right? Because we talked about job relatedness. We talked about that a lot in terms of legalities with postings and things, but job relatedness here obviously is important too. You're holding somebody to a certain criteria. You want to make sure to remind them that it actually is required as part of their job description to be able to be competent in these areas, to be able to do these things. This is a reasonable expectation of me as a soup to be asking them to perform at a higher level in these areas, okay? So you talk about SMART goals, right? So specific, measurable, objective, right? What is it specifically that we need them to be doing? How much time do they have to turn it around, right? Be really concrete about these sorts of things so that we know either they've reached it or they haven't, right? When the end comes, right? What is management going to do, right, to assist the employee in doing this? And I mean, I think this is really important when you do this. we often have, we make the mistake of making assumptions about what people need, right? So whether it's our patronage in terms of serving a community, what they want from our collection, what we think that they need in terms of programming, right? We sometimes make the mistake of making assumptions about this, like we know best. We do this too when we look at our employees and how they're performing, okay? So I prefer to have a dialogue with the individual. These are the issues. What can we do? Right? What can we do? What can we provide that might be helpful to you in improving in these areas? And some of these things, if they say, hey, man, I want to attend, 5, 6 conferences a year, or, I want you to pay for, my master's degree, or I mean, some of these things may be a little bit outlandish and unreasonable for your agencies. They may not have budgets for these. So, we talk about what is considered reasonable. In most of these cases, if it's training, if it's coaching, if there are other resources, we can usually kind of accommodate those sorts of things to a certain extent. Okay, you can get creative in those areas, even if you have limited resources. But make a commitment in that PIP. Right? It's not just about what they're promising to do in the 30, 60, or 90 days, which is typically what we're looking at for an performance improvement program, but it's what you're agreeing to do as well. Okay, so you need to hold up your end. We didn't talk about that, but PIPs, 30, 60, 90 days, these do not go on forever, right? I've inherited employees that have been on performance improvement programs for like years, right? At some point, we got to call it, right? Time of death, right? So, you need to make sure that you're enforcing these timelines that you've made both for yourself and for the employee. All right. How often we're going to meet to kind of discuss this. This is not the sort of thing where you give somebody a performance improvement plan and you say, you've got 90 days to turn it around. I'll see you on day 91. Okay. You want to be constantly providing them with feedback, going back, revisiting what's written in terms of the expectations, where they're matching up, where they still need to improve. Okay, so really, really important. The other thing obviously here is that you've always got that hammer looming, right? So important anytime that we're in a disciplinary process to make people understand what the consequences are, right? The ultimate consequence obviously is termination. So we say disciplinary action up to and including termination, which includes your suspensions, which includes, right, everything that would lead up to your terms. Okay. I want to really quickly talk about fitness for duty. Some of your organizations may have this, and it really is a great tool. Berkeley did not have this, and it was miserable for me as an HR person. I had individuals that had chronic illness, right, or had conditions where things were deteriorating, like eyesight, for instance. I had individuals that had macular degeneration. That weren't interested in opting for surgery or any kind of assistive equipment that ultimately were going to become blind. Really difficult when you're a shelver, okay? And not necessarily a reasonable expectation for us as an employer to include Braille now as part of our cataloging of materials. Maybe we'll get to that point. Maybe that's something that everybody should be doing. But at that point, we would have been able to make the case for an unreasonable accommodation. Chronic illness, had an individual, for instance, Parkinson's, right? Which was really, really difficult for the individual, difficult for me. We had sleep on the job. It was difficult for the individual to stay awake more than 2 hours a day, obviously scheduled for an 8-hour shift. The individual was responsible for a lot of data entry, which was critical to employees being able to be paid accurately. Tremors, regardless of configurations of keyboards and things, interfered with their ability to do data entry. We tried audio devices, interfered, still again with the ability to do accurate data entry. This is the sort of situation where if I had had a fitness for duty, it would have been great because I could have engaged in something like a medical separation that wouldn't have been punitive for the employee. When you don't have fitness for duty and you have no other choice but to go down a disciplinary path. Okay, so I was essentially punishing someone with written reprimands, with suspensions, with ultimately proposed terminations, basically based on their inability to do the job because of an illness, which is really an awful and ugly feeling situation. Okay, so interesting to see with your organizations if you guys do have a fitness for duty option. All right. So Q&A, we covered a lot. So does anybody have anything that they'd like to share? Any questions?
Jennifer, quick question.
Yeah.
Fitness for duty, will it be the same as employee accommodations?
It can overlap depending on, and remember when we talk about employee accommodations, we may have accommodations resulting from workers' comp. We may have accommodations resulting from an ADA option. So in most cases, if you are already on that ADA track, you actually could end up in a fitness for duty. Because in a situation like this, where maybe we were on the ADA track, for instance, for the either one of those individuals actually that I described in those scenarios would have been covered, but they had not requested any accommodation. And we had actually started to offer up accommodations, formal accommodations, and tried to engage the employees in dialogue. I talked to you about modifying keyboards for the shelving, situation. We had areas where we had much better lighting in the stacks than we did in other areas. So we tried to kind of confine the individual to doing work in that area. It became the sort of situation where it was like, I can only put materials away on the top shelf, because when I tilt my head a certain way on the lower parts of the stacks, I lose my vision completely. Right at that point, you're in a situation where you have exhausted, right? You've exhausted the accommodations that you can make. And so you would engage in a fitness for duty conversation. Yeah, absolutely.
And would that lead potentially to job relocation, like relocation of duties?
It can, yeah, depending on what your contract says. In some cases, you might be able to reassign that individual to a different location. You might be able to reassign them to a different role or a different classification. In some situations, if you actually are part of a larger agency, like the Berkeley Public Library, obviously is part of the city of Berkeley, say maybe the library didn't have opportunities for that individual that met their restrictions, but there might have been some other job opportunities somewhere in the city that seemed like a lateral in terms of hours, in terms of skill set, in terms of pay. You might see that sort of transfer. And that's usually when, if you have an equal employment officer that's actually on site, they'll usually kind of explore and facilitate those sorts of things with you. What are we looking at in terms of the employee's abilities? Where do we have jobs that, that are a good match for those abilities, regardless of how limited they were? In this situation, we had an individual that couldn't, physically, I think actually when we engaged in the dialogue with the employee, through the employee with the physician, it became really clear that continuing to go to work was actually detrimental to the condition with the Parkinson's situation. The social aspects were great, but the rest of it was so incredibly stressful with the strain on his physical system. He wasn't able to get the regular naps that he needed. He wasn't able to get the nutrition that he needed. He wasn't able to get the treatment with the frequency that he needed. So we ultimately engaged in a medical separation at that point, but it was really ugly getting there. But yeah, when you have exhausted essentially your options for accommodation, if you have the option for fitness for duty, this is where it would come into play. And sometimes it absolutely can result in you putting the employee in another position. Yeah.
Okay.
Good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Anybody else?
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. So first of all, I love my employer. Preface. I say this, but we we have tended to depend a lot on what we call TPTs, temporary part-time staff. They're unbenefited.
We all do, right? It's a great way to get labor and save money. And we pass it off as wanting to increase diversity and give people that normally wouldn't work for us opportunities. But
oh yes, oh yeah, there we go.
Yeah, that's all right. Just tell it like it is, man. Yes, we're all in the same boat.
Yeah. So and I work for the city of Oakland. We have a lot of rules, strong union environment, but TPTs do not receive performance evaluations. They don't receive work plans. So when it comes to counseling, coaching, correction. That seems to be a place that's left off. I think the easiest thing is often just to take them off the schedule. Yep. Because I think, yes, sure, I'm in a meeting. I'm sorry, distance learning, pandemic. Because I think, I don't know whether it's a fear of the process or because of the strong union environment, I can speculate. It's just you end up having folks around sometimes for a long time who have known issues and they're not released. And then these same folks will apply for like permanent positions.
Yep.
And then for decades, like, and not get them. And there seems to be like not a conversation with them about, like, nobody wants to or feels like they can have the conversation to be direct, because then they're worried about like litigation or being used against them or grievance with the union. And I guess the second part of that, the theme is then we have folks who are permanent employees who've been around for decades and they are not performing well. They're a burden to the organization, but there seems to be a active, I don't know what's the word, lack of encouragement to pursue discipline because of how much paperwork and how intensive it is. So I don't know if you could just speak to all of that. All of that.
No, it's so there's a lot of stuff going on there, and it's all stuff that happens everywhere. I'm sure everybody, even though I don't have my I can't see your faces, I'm sure a lot of you are nodding. So the first thing is, and we all have them, is this idea of your temp or non-benefited employees. In some cases, they may be represented. In some cases, they may not. If they're represented, then in most cases, they are going to be obviously entitled to progressive discipline, and they probably will be part of that performance improvement program. Now, where you have individuals that aren't, I think that, I mean, it's difficult for you. I don't think that you can necessarily decide to do this on an individual level. Either your library decides, hey, we're going to invest some time in these folks. We've invested time, obviously, in training them up to get them to be able to do the job. Do we want to intervene when we see that things are kind of going awry? And, the sad thing is I think in most cases, it's probably more important that we do, that we take corrective action with these individuals, because usually what's happening is they probably get shortchanged when they get trained anyway. They're usually brought in kind of on demand, so we just kind of plug them into one particular thing. They haven't even learned the whole job, they've just learned aspects of the job, and then they go into a different location with different people and they're required to do a different task. So these are the individuals that fall through the cracks. So, I mean, I think that there's no reason with an unrepresented employee that you can't engage in some type of counseling process. You're probably not going to go as formal as a PIP because those do take a lot of time. But to at least say, hey, I saw this. This is, not how we do this particular thing. Let me show you how to do it right. And then, the thing about that, and where I think a lot of these, when I say fall through the cracks, is because they're working so many different locations. We don't really talk a lot about our temp employees. We don't talk to each other as supervisors about our temp employees. We don't talk as managers about our temp employees. Okay. So finding a way to actually dialogue is important here to figure out who we actually have on our roles. What we had is obviously we call them intermittents. We don't call them, you gave me an acronym. And what I learned is we had a lot of those individuals. It was like, oh my God, why are they even still employed? Why are we even, making them available to schedule? And, I realize you don't have access to HR, so you're going to have to do the legwork yourself, but is identifying, everybody that's actually in that particular class that has that particular pay code. Your payroll department can run that report and show you exactly who you have on your current roles. And then calling around and saying, when did this last person work? Who do they work for? What's their performance been like? Do we even want to keep them on, right? If you don't want to keep them on, you need to pull them off the list. But what you also need to do, and what I've found helpful, is to actually send them, and HR you can engage your HR department in this and send them a letter just letting them know that their temporary employment has come to an end. At that point, then they kind of understand that they can't continue to shop themselves around. right? Which is what a lot of our temp people that don't do well, right? One place stops calling them, so they start calling another location, a different branch that doesn't know that they're problematic. And then it takes however many weeks or months for that branch to figure out they're problematic. They stop calling them, then they move on to another location. They're like, well, I'm going to work in children's services. They're nice and they don't know me. I can fool them for 5 weeks, right? So that's one thing I would say about that. The other thing that you've got, right, is, and we see this everywhere, is we've got career employees that have been with us forever that are underperformers. And I was always the one, right, that would have the conversations with these individuals when they get passed over for employment opportunities. Obviously, they're internal candidates, right? So in most all cases, we're going to interview them, right? We're mandated to include them in the process. We haven't actually had a conversation with them, a candid conversation with them about why they're not getting the jobs. It was my responsibility to actually do that. So as supervisors, you can do that. Your HR person, because they don't have intimate knowledge of these individuals, is probably not going to do that. But as supervisors, you can do that and try to kind of interrupt the cycle. Okay. When we're talking about discipline related to performance, it starts with your performance evaluations. Okay. You've got to be candid. You've got to be accurate. You've got to do a good job, right? That's the foundation of your disciplinary action when you've got performance issues, not conduct, but when you've got performance issues, it's all about that performance appraisal, right? So you've got to invest the time. You've got to be honest. Okay. And you've got to start to lay the groundwork. Okay, then you do, and usually people will do the counseling. They may even do the verbal warning, but it seems to me that people don't like to escalate beyond that. Or I would get into an employee's file and I'd see that they had 3 or 4 written reprimands, right, for the same issue. And it was like, at some point we've actually got to escalate and pull the trigger. And the only thing that I can tell you is I can tell you that it does come to an end at some point. But what I find is that most supervisors and managers spend a lot more time either avoiding dealing with the issues or continuing to have counseling sessions, 30, 40 counseling sessions over an employee's lifespan, multiple verbal warnings, multiple written reprimands. If we had actually looked at all of those actions, we could have moved through suspension and termination a long time ago, assuming you have legitimate grounds. So it's ugly, it's awkward, it's messy, it is absolutely time consuming. But I can tell you that I had a number of, for lack of a better word, successful terminations, right? We really did clean a lot of that up. And I think that what it did is it set a tone in terms of our culture, that we were an organization that was going to have these expectations, reasonable expectations, and that we were going to enforce those. What we started to see is individuals would they'd pony up and they start performing at a higher level, or as soon as we increased a little bit of heat on them and they saw, okay, I'm in the same process my coworker was, I know how that's going to end, I'm going to go ahead and just resign or find something else. I'm going to leave BPL and I'm going to go be a problem at OPL, right? So it's really important to be consistent in the way that you do that and to do the work. Otherwise you literally will carry these folks, I kid you not, for like 40 years. And what happens is you've got underperforming individuals, your good folks then end up picking up the slack. They get tired, they get burnt out, they get resentful, and they leave, right? And so then you're left with nothing but the mediocre. So you've got to deal with the mediocre. Does that answer that at all? There's no quick and easy way to do it other than to really stay the course and escalate. Don't continue to circle around this nonsense, the mamby-pamby counselings and verbal warnings, when you see that you're not seeing any change in the behavior.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Was it helpful? Okay.
Thank you.
All right. And I didn't send problem cases to OPL, just so you know.
So building on that question, Jenifer, my question is very related. If you have an employee that is meeting the minimum requirements of their job specs or their job description, but isn't necessarily meeting like the standard of the rest of the department, is there any way to go through that discipline process, or is it just kind of they're meeting the minimums?
If they're meeting the minimums, what I would say is they're meeting the minimums. And that basically is, right, on our evaluations, meets minimum qualifications is passing. So if you start to pursue disciplinary action related to performance on somebody who's meeting minimum qualifications, you're probably seen as a bully. You're probably going to be seen as somebody who's singling that out. You know, what I would hope, and we'll talk a little bit, I'm doing terrible on time management, you guys, so we're gonna have to burn through the rest of this. But when we look at appreciative inquiry, that might be a place where you can incorporate some new strategies to try to get that individual to perform up to the level of the rest of the group. Because it sounds like what you have is you've got an overperforming group that's obviously beyond the minimum. Sometimes peer pressure can help with that, but sometimes actually just engaging them in a positive dialogue can go a long way. So we'll talk a little bit about appreciative inquiry and what we can do as part of our performance appraisals to try to kind of energize and motivate folks. Sometimes that can help, but minimum qualifications are exactly that, you guys. If people are meeting them, it doesn't mean that they're problematic. It just means that they can strive for more.
Perfect, thank you.
All right. So why do we conduct these things, right? So we've got all these really great reasons. We want to improve the performance. We want to increase engagement. We want to increase motivation, job satisfaction. Oh my gosh, I'm not even going to ask for a show of hands, but how often do you think they actually do this, right? They fail, right? They fail. So what we see with and most of us are sucked into this, right? I'm not in total denial, right? Berkeley required the annual performance appraisal. We had this awful template with the check boxes we had to work with. I mean, it was really, really difficult, right? To try to be innovative and creative about our process when the city was very, very clear that we had to use this particular tool. And I'm not going to say in this particular way because we did change that up a little bit, but that we had to use this particular tool on this particular timeline, right? So lots of problems that we've inherited with these annual performance evaluations, right? They cover way too much. We're meeting once a year. That's a whole lot to cover. It's a whole lot to remember. I can't remember what's happening during the year. And that's just in my own life, let alone a supervisor who may have 5, 6, 10 direct reports. Forget about it. How accurate can you be, right? Monologue, not a dialogue. Sometimes this is because of time constraints. Sometimes it's because it's just awkward and unpleasant. Sometimes we may not even have a monologue, right? A lot of my supervisors would literally just either email an evaluation to an employee or leave it cold in their box, right? Please, you guys, try to find the time to make this a more positive and rewarding process for yourself and your employees. Okay. The other thing, the surprise, obviously, we've all heard about this, that nothing should be surprising when you enter into a performance appraisal, right? These should all be things that have been addressed before. Now, you may have an employee that's in denial and says, you never said that. But obviously, if it's something that you've addressed before, it doesn't qualify as a surprise. These are the things where it's like, man, I've been holding this for 8 months. Voila, this is a problem. Okay. During this one meeting, they should know about it. They shouldn't go in blind. Right? So annual performance evaluation versus performance management. And this is kind of what I'm hoping we strive for. Again, like disciplinary action, right? Time consuming, requires your attention, extra work. But if we can put it in on the front end, what we see is right, that we get all of these wonderful benefits, right? So it actually is worth our while. The investment's worth our while, right? So we set goals and objectives it's a collaborative process, right? We're actually working together, in terms of what we plan to actually achieve and how we're going to do it. We talked about this with the PIP, right? We're not only measuring their performance, but also their progress, right? I have so many supervisors that literally would never even look back at the previous performance appraisals. They would just start anew every year. And it's like, if we're supposed to be building and growing, we need to look at the historical record here, right? So look at the great things that they've done and how far they've come. Hopefully there's been some movement there. If they know you're never going to look back, then they're not going to bother to look forward, okay? Providing continual feedback, right? This means that there are all kinds of opportunities, right? We see them all the time, or we may get reports from further, other coworkers or from patrons, right? Be able to provide continual feedback, both positive and constructive, right? Not necessarily just bringing to highlight, those things that are problematic or aren't meeting expectations, but the good stuff that we see, right? We're isolating performance problems, right? That's one of the reasons that we're so trying to be specific, is because we don't want it to be about the person, right? This is not about the person, it's about the behavior. Sometimes when you go into these appraisals, man, it feels like they're just down on you, right? And it's hard to dig out of that. So let's make it about an isolated behavior, okay? Reinforce and recognize positive performance. And I don't mean to throw that off like it's casually, but we're going to dive into appreciative inquiry. So those of you who have trained in appreciative inquiry or maybe attended my stuff in appreciative inquiry, AI, which we'll refer to it, is this idea of looking at what we have that's good, looking at what we have that's working. What are people doing well, right? So we can apply this to a variety of areas in our library, but we can definitely start to incorporate a little of this stuff into our performance appraisals or our performance management system. Okay, so AI, David Cooperrider is the founder. He was a student at Case Western University, and he actually got a gig because Cleveland Clinic, which is right near the campus, had bought a hotel so that people could actually stay there, family members, visiting patients, or maybe even have patients rehabilitate in a more comfortable setting. But the hotel was a total crapper, right? Like 1 star, and they wanted this 5-star hotel. And most of it was the employees bickering and a lot of service issues. So what he did, instead of going in and saying, this is bad, this doesn't work, this is wrong, I need you to do these things, he just took these folks and he sent them to a 5-star hotel in Chicago for like a week and said, I just want you to take a record of everything that improves your experience here, everything that you enjoy about this place, everything that makes this place great. And so that's what they focused on for a full week. And they were so inspired by kind of living in that positive place that literally within 2 months, that 1-star hotel was a 5-star hotel, and they didn't have to change any of their staff. It's crazy, right? So the appreciative obviously is this idea of the gratitude. The inquire is the seeking out, right? That's the action portion. That's the looking to see, what it is that's good and how can we make more of it? How can we build on that? How can we find it? What can we do here? So appreciative inquiry, right? So just so you know, typically, especially in Western culture, we have a tendency to default to a deficit-based approach, right? Which means that, right? And I mean, most of our models, right, are focused on problem solving. Identify the problem. What's the cause of the problem? Propose solutions, right? That's our model, right? That's our model, and that's typically where we live. And as a consultant, that's usually what I am often asked to do, is to come in and look at what's wrong, right? And fix it. It's a very diagnostic model, similar to what you see in hospitals, right? You go in, you have an illness, they try to figure out what the cause is, and then they fix it. They make you better. A lot of consequences, right? To this deficit-based approach, this kind of perspective or this way of thinking, right? You get a lot of blame and division, a lot of bad feelings. It often has this kind of authoritative top-down approach, right? After a while, people feel just like this image, right? They feel kind of beaten down. They're tired. They're kind of overwhelmed, just dragging, right? These are not the things that we want, right? We want engagement. We want an energy. We want enthusiasm. We want motivation, innovation, right? So I would just ask you to think about the tool that we use, which we have to use, right? We've all got the freaking forms. I'm not saying that you tear that up and you create something anew, but consider that those tools are deficit-based in nature and how we might use them differently, okay? A strengths-based approach or appreciative inquiry. Many of you have probably been through leadership programs and done Strengths Finder and strengths training. Very similar, right? We're looking at what's working. We're asking lots of questions. We're doing this at all levels. It has to be completely inclusive, right? So we want there to be collaboration, okay? We want there to be engagement. Envisioning this idea of what might be, right? So there's kind of this imaginatory portion, right, that requires creativity. And you can do that. You can think beyond because you're already kind of in this positive place, right? As opposed to what we saw with the rain clouds and not wanting to look up. So leveraging the positive. Okay, the results obviously very, very different. You can see that the woman goes from no flowers to flowers and a smile, and she's even got a window in her room now. Very, very different, right? In terms of the conversation. And just so you know, it doesn't mean that we ignore problems, right? So like an example that I can think of, because I already mentioned tardiness and it's at the forefront of my mind, would be an employee that comes in late, right? Not just a one-off, right? Not just a one-off. A one-off, you're like, hey, they say, I'm sorry I'm late. It's like, it's been acknowledged. That's not their norm, right? But somebody where we start to see that there's kind of a habit forming here, right? A trend, we intervene. And so a conversation like that, right, typically would go, you've been late on this date and this date and this date, however many minutes. Your job requires you to be here on time. When you're not on time, this happens and these people don't like you and they can't move on to their next duty or get off desk. And this person was late for their lunch and it throws my whole schedule off and it's bad for morale, right? That's the conversation we typically have because we've been trained to have a conversation in that way, right? So what I would ask you is, where possible, maybe try it out and say, okay, it's not that I'm not going to look at tardiness. It's a problem, right? It's an issue. But maybe what I do is I flip that on its head and I have a conversation with the employee and I can say, I've kind of noticed this trend of you coming in late. Do you remember what it felt like that? And if we're talking about somebody, I'm thinking about somebody who was late all the time, right? And I mean, his coworkers just loathed him because they knew they were always going to be late to lunch. They wouldn't be able to get to their program to set up the room. They knew if he was on the schedule to relieve them, they were screwed basically. And they loathed him. And he felt it. And so to have this conversation, you remember last week, on Tuesday, when you showed up like to the desk 10 minutes early, and do you remember what the reaction was of the coworker, the person that you relieved, that they greeted you, that they said good morning, they made eye contact, they smiled, they thanked you for actually coming in on time, which is ridiculous, but it happened. They didn't actually avoid getting into your elevator later in the day, right? You remember how great that felt for you. Yeah, I do that. It felt really, really good, right? The employee is getting lighter, getting taller in that moment. You say, okay, so let's talk about what happened that morning. How was it that you got here 10 minutes early? How can we go ahead and replicate that, right? And then you go into detail about all those different steps and which bus we need to catch and whether or not we need to get a good night's sleep the night before and all of those things, right? Trying to identify all those things that contribute to that successful outcome that morning on Tuesday, and trying to recreate that. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about AI, right? So we see increased engagement, greater job satisfaction, improved communication, right? More buy-in, more agility, right? Anytime that we're innovative, change becomes easier, morale is higher, really, really good stuff that we see when we start working more so with appreciative inquiry, right? So we're going from this idea of what's wrong, how do we fix it, to what's working, what's possible, and how do we get more of what works for us and what's good for us, right? And I think that's the really important part when we look at AI and performance appraisals, okay? So obviously when we talk about AI, we're asking these positive questions, okay? And I'll give you another slide that has, I told you my slides are really wordy, but it's for a reason. I want you to be able to use them, give you a bunch of examples of questions that you can use during your performance appraisals. Some of the other things that you can do, even though we're stuck with the same crappy tool, is focusing on, sorry, I'm making sure Christine isn't texting me to tell me that I've lost you guys, so I have to look down at my phone every now and again. Focusing on the development plan, okay? A lot of times what we do is we put emphasis on the deficiencies and emphasis on those boxes where we don't meet requirements, right? And it's like, that's the whole focus of the meeting. I know that's my focus when I get my performance eval, man. I go in and I flip through that immediately and I'm looking for anything that's less than exceeds, right? That's less than exceeds, because I am deficit focused and I, am looking for negative feedback. I actively seek it out. The wiring is a little off up here, but I know that about myself, right? So I have to compensate in other ways. Some of the things that we can do with the tool that we've been given is put a greater emphasis on the development plan. Okay, make this a collaborative effort, stretch a little bit, right? You can do some things there by focusing on the development plan, making sure that you're looking at your past evaluations, development plan there, and then highlighting the achievements, right? What goals have we met? That is awesome. Let's continue to build on it. What do you want to do this year? Right? An achievements list, I really love. And this is another thing that you can keep in your supervisor's file throughout the year, right? I think it's good to ask your employee to write up an achievements list. Some of them will partake, others not. But what you basically do is say, you know, what's the stuff that you've done that you're proud of? You know, what have you accomplished this year? Have them do that in advance of you even writing up the evaluation, because I think it's a really good trigger for your memory. You've got a lot to remember, man, if you're only doing these one time a year and you're doing multiples, right? To try to remember everything good, right? You've probably got a supervisor's file that shows you the bad, but everything good that an employee has actually achieved during the year, this can help kind of color that meeting and the tone, right? And then again, I've already mentioned this, but the idea that you are doing this together, right? If you do it solo and you're leaving this stuff cold and you're not engaging them in the process or working to get them to engage in the process, these, you know, it's just wasted hours for you. Every year it's wasted hours. And I'm sure for a lot of you, it feels like a futile exercise, right? So I would suggest, even though again, you know, it's going to require a little more work and a little more time, to maybe think about incorporating some of these things and changing your approach, even though you have to use the same tool, and see if you find the experience easier and more rewarding. I'm betting money that your staff will too. Okay, so I've given you guys just a full slide, and there are more of these in the encyclopedia of appreciative questions. I think I can send that actually to Christine if you guys are interested, and she can forward that out. Tons of different positively skewed questions for a variety of different situations, not just performance appraisals. But I wanted you guys to be able to have this just in your back pocket to try to incorporate some of these things. So before we dive into unions, just maybe 1 minute for questions. Is everybody so excited that they just went out and like ran a lap around their house after the AI segment? All right, we'll move on to unions and then we can come back to anything that you guys may have. So this slide is slowly but surely becoming obsolete. It'll be really interesting when we talk about unions at work. And I realize a lot of you, I'm sorry that this is kind of where the emphasis is. I'm hoping you're still kind of getting some things. If you are a non-union shop or you don't have unions representing any portion of your workforce, I'm hoping this isn't a complete waste of time. But I know for a lot of us, this is a huge part of our day-to-day. So understanding how to navigate it and not feel threatened or intimidated by it is important. So when we see unions at work, right, we've got this idea of a union shop, agency shop, open shop, and I mentioned slowly, these things are kind of just falling away. Union shops, we don't really see anymore. In most cases, those are illegal. Agency shops, which is where you remember you could opt out and not pay dues, but you still had to pay a comparable fee. And that didn't necessarily go to the union. You could choose a charity or a religious organization that money would get routed to, but they were still tapping your check, right? Agency shop fees now are illegal in California, I think as of 2018. So you shouldn't be seeing those in your agency anymore. And open shop, when we talk about the union representing the entire bargaining unit, right? Regardless of whether or not you pay dues and are a dues paying member. In most of our cases, we can either be a dues paying member or not. If we're not, it means the union doesn't represent us during disciplinary actions. But in an open shop, it's a little bit different. We consider these to be right to work states. California, as of right now, is not a right to work state. Okay, and there is some grumbling right about now that actually might change given the new administration. So there's a lot of talk here. So this slide can change within the next 6 months to a year. So it'll be really interesting. So you guys may have a variety of different manifestations of this in your libraries. So some important definitions, right? We've got a labor union, collective bargaining, bargaining unit. Collective bargaining is the important part, right? That's usually our CBA or our MOU, our memorandum of understanding. This is the contract for the agreement, right? In addition to, we've covered labor laws and things like that, both at the federal level, at the state level. Within our organizations, if we have an MOU, we actually have a binding contract. It's usually good for a couple of years, sometimes can be extended for multiple years beyond that, where both employer and representation, hopefully including employee representation, have come together and kind of made agreements, right? About leave, about number of holidays we get, about our progressive discipline process, right? Work hours, conditions, benefits, all of that good stuff. It's in this binding contract. And then we come back together and we renegotiate every couple of years. bargaining units. And so we may have a contract, we may have multiple contracts in our libraries representing at Berkeley, for instance, I had like, I think three or four different unions actually operating within the library, right? Each one of those different unions had their own contracts. And then within that contract, you'll have a bargaining unit, right? So what you may see is like you have a union that oversees the bulk of maybe your library employees, but your librarians may be in a different bargaining unit than your line staff, your library aides, assistants, et cetera, okay? And then you'll find that there are different clauses within your contract that dictate that there are different rules, right? So that could be vacation accrual, et cetera. Those are different depending on your bargaining units. So just some language for you guys so you can kind of get better acquainted. When we talk about the idea of unions, private sector, and I think there are going to be, because we said we've got private libraries, we've got museums, we may have law libraries, specialized libraries. Some of you may still be covered under NLRA. That's the federal law, right, that allows your place of employment to organize. Okay. For those of you who aren't in those sorts of situations and you're not considered part of the private sector, you'll default to the public sector, right? So the public sector in California is actually overseen by PERB, which is the Public Employment Relations Board. Underneath that, right, we've got these different laws that govern different groups of employment. Okay, so the EERA, for instance, Educational Employment Relations Act, the DILS Act, right, is bargaining for just state government employees, right? Most of us that are city and county are going to be under the MMBA, which is the Myers-Milius-Brown Act. But I think there are like 13 different acts or laws in the state of California. They cover, BART employees, right? Judicial employees. So everybody essentially has a different law, depending on what industry you're working in, that then you are essentially working under, okay? So MMBA then dictates specifics about maybe things like meet and confer. A lot of you may have experienced those sorts of things. Myers-Milius-Brown Act gives you specific instructions on what's required during an employee's meet and confer, right? And that they're entitled by law to an opportunity to meet and confer, for instance, anytime you're looking to make significant changes to, say, wages, et cetera. Anytime you're looking to change something that might be addressed already in that negotiated contract, all right, essentially. All right, so general, I know I'm flying, guys, and I apologize, but I know Christine's got a hard 11:30 stop time, so I want to make sure that we get through this and have an opportunity for questions. So when we talk about rights under labor unions, right, if you have a union that's actually operating in your library, right, it gives them the right to negotiate, gives them a right to form, gives employees a right to join. You have the right to discuss your wages and benefits, right, during these contract negotiations, right? You have the right to strike and picket, depending on what the situation is. So these are all of the rights that we're essentially entitled to by way of being under a union, right? Important to know that the employer is not allowed to in any way engage in some kind of retaliatory behavior because of union activity or union involvement, right? We can't meddle. We cannot, as an employer, interfere. We can't block them from joining, from starting, from attending meetings if the contract does indeed allow for time off to do that, right? We can't threaten retaliation like demotions, like terminations. We can't say you can't wear that SEIU t-shirt on work premises. We can't do those things. Okay, all of those things are authorized activities under the union, and the employee is best served to allow those things to occur. So you can see over here, for those of you who know Office Space, I got to watch it at least once a year, but poor Milton over here, man, he was another one. He kept showing up and was he getting a check or not getting a paycheck? I can't remember that part. So I was thinking to watch it again. But he actually got pushed all the way down into the basement where they were telling him not to do his job, right? But to take care of the rodent problem that was down there, right? So retaliatory behavior, completely illegal. completely illegal when it comes to retaliation based on union activities. Now, that being said, there are some things that I haven't included in here, and you guys may have questions about soliciting, right? Passing out what we consider to be propaganda. I don't know if that's still a term that people use in 2021, but materials, can't do that sort of thing during work time. Okay, they can do it on break time. They can do it before their shift. They can do it in non-work areas in terms of posting things. Okay, I would encourage you guys just to try to kind of create an amicable and open relationship with your union. Hopefully most of you have areas in your staff areas where you have designated boards for the union to post things about different activities, about elections, about new information about labor laws, surveys, etc. Give them a place to put that stuff. But it can't go into the work areas, and it cannot be on work time. All right, so important to understand that, because I think a lot of us never really know where we can put our foot down in terms of certain types of activities. All right, and I still finished with 5 minutes for Q&A. So I would love to hear about any questions that you guys have. And if you don't have questions, what I'm going to do to fill the next 5 minutes, in addition to thanking you for attending, is a couple of questions came across in the survey. And I'm assuming that the authors of the questions might actually be with us today, but there were a couple of questions about how to supervise friends and how to deal with a situation where you have a coworker or an employee that is, for lack of a better word, doesn't smell good. So we can spend the next couple of minutes exploring those or exploring any questions that you guys might have. Anybody have any questions? Christine, is anybody with us?
I asked the one about the friends, and I would love to.
Oh, I didn't mean to. Yeah, I didn't want to out anybody.
Oh, I'm okay with that. I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not supervising a friend right now, but as I gain more responsibilities in the organization, I can see it happening, and
it's coming. Yeah, it's coming. And I would love to hear, because I think it's always great, because I learned so much from you guys too, just by talking. So I would love to hear other people's suggestions for this. I think for me, the thing that has always been helpful is just to have and you can do this with a friend, is to have a candid conversation. And I always come from a place of, this is how it makes me feel, man. I mean, it's really hard for me to say these things to you. And our relationship while we're at work is going to have to be a little bit different for a couple reasons. One, I need to hold you to the same standards as everybody else. And two, you may find that maybe I'm not as friendly, or, I'm not doing the inside joke thing, because I don't want the other staff here to feel like I'm giving you preferential treatment or I'm alienating anybody else. And, I really hope that you can understand that this is difficult, and I want to continue to have, our relationship outside of work. I don't want this to interfere in any way. I hope that we can continue to have an open dialogue about that, if indeed, there is anything that makes you feel awkward or uncomfortable. Yeah. Really tough though. It's far worse when you've worked alongside them and then you get promoted.
Really what I mean is when I say friends, like friends you made in the organization and have become like confidants, or maybe you have been upset at administration about the same things along the way up. And now now I'm kind of a middle manager, and it's hard and awkward.
It is. And I can tell you that I kind of lived in that world in HR. And you walk a fine line. I think that you can still be critical of things. You can absolutely still be critical of things. I think I always tried to be critical of things in the way of, let's talk about these things that aren't working, so that we can, again, a deficit-based or problem-solving model, but so that we can improve upon them, not just get together and bitch. I can tell you that where I used to get together and have drinks and bitch with folks, you become a supervisor and it's really difficult to do that. I haven't found a successful way to be able to do that and not have it color things when you go back into work. Sometimes what it means when you promote is that you just don't have those kinds, not that you can't have a friendship, but that you just don't have that kind of conversation anymore in an informal setting. Yeah, but it is definitely tough. But, I mean, one thing I would say is that I didn't really say stuff. I make it a habit of not saying stuff to my coworkers or to even subordinates that I wouldn't say to my boss. If there's a problem, then we all need to talk about it. So I think that might be a good rule to operate by as you move forward, and then to also just own it, like you did with me. It's like, we used to have conversations and say this kind of stuff, and we used to be able to get together and vent and bitch about stuff, and you need to kind of understand my new role. And the other thing that you need to let them know is, if you're going to continue to have that relationship, will it be in confidence, or are you going to go to the boss and then say so-and-so complained about so-and-so, we need to take action? Because, you're not the only one who's uncomfortable. They may feel very vulnerable in that situation because they've confided in you, and now you're in a position of authority. So, yeah, I don't know how helpful that is. I'm just kind of thinking out loud.
Oh, that's helpful. That is helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, I think just transparency as much as you can, asking them where they're at, telling them where you're at, I think is, especially if you already have a relationship, there should be room for that kind of conversation. Any other questions about the stuff that we covered? I kind of blew through it, you guys.
Lucia had a question, and it was, is it that the union information cannot be in the work area, or is it to the discretion of the manager?
I would probably try to find a designated area for that. It's not that it can't be there, but I mean, you are within your rights as an employer, including management, that if it were in a work area, that you could remove those things. So I kind of liked to keep it separate, but that may have been what also contributed to us having an adversarial relationship with the union, which we did. I'll own it. It was very heated and very complicated, and I think we did a lot of relationship building there, and we improved considerably, but there was not a lot of trust there. So it's not that it can't be there. Now, if you have a representative, not one of your staff members, but like if you had a president or someone who came in and insisted on putting those materials there, they are absolutely not entitled to put them there. If you as a manager, and I wouldn't even say make this choice as a manager, I think that this needs to be at an organizational level. Either we're going to allow it or we're not. And if we're not, people need to know where this stuff actually goes, where it lives, and where they can leave it, and when they can talk about it. Yeah, I don't know that I would be making those decisions as a supervisor or a manager of just a particular unit, division, branch, because I think that creates conflicts within the organizational culture. I think there needs to be some consistency and message there. That's me. So I'm going to say real quick, because I know Christine has to go, but this idea, and I don't know.
Say it's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I actually had this happen. I've had this happen on 2 occasions, and I'll share both stories with you really quickly. In Berkeley, we actually had a clause in our administrative regulations that said we could not wear fragrances while we were in employ. Right. So no perfume, no, and we had a patron, that would habitually come in. Right. And he would actually use pine air fresheners on his person. And we were able to, put him back outside, because he had violated that particular, I don't know if we called it an ordinance or what we called it. But anyway, we actually had legislation related to this idea of scent and offensive scents. And offensive obviously is pretty subjective. But the idea is if, if more than one person consider it to be overpowering, offensive, troubling, etc., it qualified. So I had 2 different situations. One was an individual that the employees had basically come to me and said it was, a body odor issue. And so I did not take them at their word. I made sure that I set up situations where I could be in close proximity of the individual and make sure that it wasn't just malicious or a personal attack on this individual. And I did find that, there was definitely something going on there that a reasonable person would consider it to be an offensive scent. I called the individual into my office and I immediately said, this is really awkward for me. And I do not like that I'm having to have this conversation. It may make you uncomfortable, but I need to say that I've noticed. And so, that there's kind of an unpleasant odor coming from your person. And so, at that point, right, you get into a lot of areas because you have absolutely no idea what it is that's causing this. I could have an individual that's got a disability that's on some type of medication, and that's resulted in this new odor. It could be dietary, maybe something that they're eating and secreting. I know that my partner, man, she eats curry and it's like, I can smell that stuff for 2 days coming out of her pores, right? So could be a variety of things. Could be an individual that maybe is now houseless, that might be living out of their car, that doesn't have access to facilities. So, this is, you can feel, right, the sensitivity of this topic. So to try to kind of figure out and help them, if they're comfortable doing that, dialogue about what the potential causes could be. In this case, this individual just really hadn't made a big priority of hygiene and was reusing his clothing every day when he would come into work. He had the same dirty shirt the whole week. He'd leave it in his locker. So he started to kind of modify some of those behaviors. And we completely turned it around. The other one, right, which was even more challenging, and I discussed this with Christine, but I'll share it with you briefly. I had an employee that came and said, this individual is wearing a really strong scent at work. I get a headache. It irritates my sinuses, my nasal passages, etc. You need to make her stop. And so again, in a situation where, kind of made sure that I was, because since I was the one that was going to take the meeting, wanted to make sure that I could address this with firsthand knowledge. And kind of get a scent, but doesn't really smell like perfume. Couldn't really figure out what it was. But it definitely was. It was a strong, very, I thought it was pleasant, but anyway, it was a strong fragrance. And met with the employee, and the employee told me I wear no perfume. I wear, deodorant and antiperspirant, and, I shower and stuff, but I'm not wearing any perfume. I had 2 meetings, not wearing any perfume. It was actually the branch head came to me and said, she was African-American female, said, hey, I think that what it might be is her hair product. There are certain type of hair products that we use that have this particular fragrance, and I've identified it. And at that point, like I told Christine, it became a very, very sensitive situation, but for very different reasons, right? Because now all of a sudden, as opposed to being on this kind of, I was worried about being on my ADA, right, violating a protected class. Now I'm looking at race and ethnic issues, violating a protected class. So at that point, to be honest with you, I felt like, when I looked at it a little more closely and I went back to the employee that reported the situation, it started to feel to me a little personal. And so what I offered that employee was to stagger shifts so that the individual wouldn't be present. Because I didn't want to have to, I'll be totally honest, I did not want to have the conversation. I have some Black female friends that are very particular about their hair. And I learned early on not to touch it. But I also, I know that they feel really strongly about some of the products they use. And once they find something that works, that's a big deal. And so I did not want to have that conversation. I hope nothing I'm saying is offensive to folks. I think that anytime we have these conversations, there's obviously potential for that. So hopefully I haven't put my foot in my mouth, but those are 2 examples of having smelly, whether for the good or the bad, employees that I've had to deal with on site. So I don't know if the individual that is actually with us that posed that question is still here and has anything that they would like to suggest or ask, but those are my 2 stories regarding scent. Anybody else have either one of those examples, working with a friend or maybe having an employee that had a particular odor about them, how they've had to address those situations that they can share with the rest of the cohort?
I do.
Share, please do.
My supervisor, she actually approached me and she said, you know what, there's something about the cologne you have. Someone complained about it. And they're like, okay, really? All right. Which one? 7 different ones. Can you please tell me? And just for now on, this is just one person who said, but I know that you smell fantastic. Yeah, I always love the way you smell. From now on, just like, okay, so it's just me. And that person ever was close to me. She was, I'm not going to tell you who that person is, but she just went by that person. It's all it took. And that person went straight to HR. It was like, I felt like singled out for something, which was very minimal. So I stopped wearing colognes for a month.
How, and what did HR say? Did they ever approach you?
No, well, our regional supervisor, he was the one that approached me, that approached my supervisor, and that cascaded down to me.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I had one of those little papers.
Yeah. It's it's I mean, I've have conversations about individuals, right? I mean, we probably all have somebody at work. You may even be somebody at work that microwaves fish in the break room, right? Or even popcorn, like, right? Popcorn can get to you depending on the time of day. So, I mean, this is all stuff we've got to kind of live together. And so, we need to be able to find safe environments where we can have these kinds of conversations. And it's okay to do that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times we're afraid to have a conversation. I mean, I can tell you those are probably two, the body odor thing, those are, for me, maybe it was something personal for me, but those were tough conversations to have. And I think that, it's not, the other thing that I would say is that your supervisor, it's a different approach, but I always like to come from a first person position and not say somebody told me or one of your coworkers, because I think a lot of times when we do that, the first thing is like, well, who was it? Well, who, and like you said, you felt singled out. If the supervisor had kind of come and said, hey, Victor, you always, I mean, I really like the way you smell, but maybe is there a way you can just kind of use a little less of that? Just because, there are people that have, we've got allergies and we've got whatever. I mean, as opposed to, I really like it, but somebody else on staff said that, you wear too much cologne.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I do think it's crazy that you've got multiple colognes. I think I had one bottle of perfume, and once it got broken, I never replaced it. I can't even imagine what your countertop looks like, but I am impressed.
No, well.
Just so you know, if you apply to Berkeley, all that crap goes into the drawer. I'm just saying.
I hear you.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
It's important when we talk about whether or not an organization is a good fit for you. Find out what their fragrance policy is, Victor. All right, you guys. I know that you need to get back. I want Christine to be able to get her weekend started. I thank you guys so much for hanging in here. I know that this is it's difficult stuff for a variety of reasons. It's unfun. It's complicated. It's a lot of information, and I know I didn't give you a lot of opportunities to have activities and things. So I appreciate you staying the course. Hopefully, you found some value in this, and and you can just feel a little more confident in not perpetuating the cycle, right? And being able to step in and kind of feeling comfortable enough to start addressing some of these situations, okay? Because we all have them. And please do use your network. You guys have created a great community, man. Lean on each other, talk about what you're doing, what's worked, what hasn't, and go from there. All right?
Hey, Jen, do you want to give like 1 minute? Because it wasn't on the original agenda, the coaching.
Oh, sure.
So do you want to give like because I really hope you want you guys to attend this.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
Really great opportunity.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate you allowing the time for that. So on June 15th, there's another one of these 90-minute sessions. This one, actually, we will have time because it's so focused on one particular topic as opposed to like all these different areas of HR. It's just going to be about coaching. And we're kind of coming at it from the perspective of, the assumption that you guys aren't going to be professional coaches, formally trained coaches, but how do we actually kind of do that sort of impromptu coaching in the workplace? The cool thing that I like about this is that you don't need to be a supervisor or manager to coach. Right? We can do that laterally, right? At any level, you can coach up, you can coach down, you can coach across, it does not matter. But talking about this is kind of a fundamental or core skill, I think, for leaders. I think it's something basic. And we'll talk about the difference between coaching and mentoring. We'll talk about being able to identify opportunities to coach, you know, like, okay, what does somebody say or do, or when might I step in? And if I do that, then what do I say? How do I approach it? What kind of tools can I provide? And then I'll contrast it, just so some of you might be interested in getting your own coaches, talk a little bit about what a formal coaching relationship looks like. So that you kind of are aware that those opportunities are out there. And then for those of you who are interested, Christine and Martine are actually letting me do 30 hours of coaching with you guys. So I actually am a professional certified coach. So I do that, particularly for leaders that are kind of trying to manage challenging, usually personnel situations. But in my world, they all seem to be relationship related, but they don't have to be. Helping you to better navigate difficult work situations. So if you are interested, and we haven't totally figured out or streamlined the logistics of that, but what'll happen after we've done that 90-minute presentation, you guys will have an opportunity to kind of coach each other and stuff. So I'm hoping it'll be fun for you. You'll have an opportunity to express interest to Christine, and then depending on the demand, hopefully we won't have to turn anybody away, but I guess the more the demand, the better. But we'll figure out how to kind of do that. But my hope is to be able to spend, you know, a couple hours or maybe, you know, 3 30-minute sessions or something with each of you if you guys are interested. And that'll give you a little taste, and then may even help you get unstuck if you've got a current challenge that you're experiencing. So June 15th, I would encourage you guys to do it, because like I said, the on the spot or on the job coaching skills, I think are invaluable. And if you can master that, you'll really start to see the people around you start to evolve and move up. And so I think that's another area when I didn't have my screen on. So Laura, I don't know if it was you that was talking about those individuals that are just meeting requirements. But that's another way that without having a disciplinary process, without doing a performance appraisal, right? Really easy, just through dialogue in the moment. You know, there are some things that we can say and do that can really enhance people's performance and engagement. That's my pitch. Let's see your kid. Who's there?
Oh, it's my, oh, sorry, I thought I was on mute.
No.
Hey. Sorry,
All right, you guys. So thank you so much. So that's my pitch for the 15th. If it's of interest to you and you think that might have some value for you, please do attend.
Thank you, Jenifer.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Jenifer, thank you so much. If you can't tell, I'm at my workplace and my coworker was behind and she was like, oh my gosh, she really